Hey, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Happy Saturday to everyone. And here's another episode between the lights and stars, or beyond the lights and stars, episode 6 with Max Derrat and also Logossteve. Just a brief of introduction on what these guys do. These are probably one of the best video essayists that I've come across through in YouTube. And also, just another added thing, there might be some technical glitches here and now and then. I'm having some issues with my internet, but let's go. Let's try to brave through this. So let me just ask a question first. How are you guys doing? Let's start with Max.
I'm all right, man. It's just a little bit earlier. Like I'm used to waking up later just because my girlfriend works nights, and I
Mm.
tried to go a little bit later into the night to accommodate her. But hey, like you wanted to talk, and I'm always happy to talk about games and profound stuff, as you and especially Steve know. So let's do it.
Thank you so much for being here, man. And also, Steve, been a long time, man. How's it going?
Oh, it's going pretty good. I luckily I wake up stupid early during the week, so I sleep in on the weekend until about 6 a.m.
Wow. So, typical morning day for you, I guess, on Saturday.
Yeah, I'm even late. I ate my breakfast late because I only just finished eating it.
Nice to hear. So, yeah, it's also Saturday out here, Saturday evening. Usually, I also start my sessions the same time. And as far as the topic is concerned, this is actually one of the things that I have in mind for Max initially. And I did throw in the idea, what if Steve actually also comes in? Since he also talks a lot about these stuff. And you being also a big fan of computers and stuff as well. So let's go ahead and I'll just try to ask a few questions also regarding this. What is your opinion regarding the advancement of AI right now, Max?
My opinion,
Yeah.
just a general opinion.
Yeah, for first, yeah, probably just a general opinion right now. Before we also interject some gaming stuff there.
I mean, I would say it honestly, dude, it honestly depends on the specific type of AI that's being advanced.
Mhm.
Like there are certain circumstances where it's perfectly fine. I would say in regards to something that we were just talking about beforehand, I need to download this thing called NVIDIA Broadcaster because it apparently has this AI functionality that gets rid of sound in the background. And by the way, speaking of background noise, you might hear a little bit in the background. Our house is getting sprayed to get rid of spiders on the outside. So
All right,
I apologize in advance if you can hear that.
that's
But
okay.
in other respects, there's always that constant worry that we've had about AI for the last, I don't know, 100 years, ever since it started being written about in sci-fi novels. Is that would it ever get to the point where it's so overly advanced that it can start thinking for itself and determining what's best for itself and whether or not those ethics conflict with ours as humanity?
Mhm.
We've certainly had scenarios happen thus far where we have legitimate worries for that. Like I think there was one example where I don't know. I think it might have been like a couple guys at Microsoft that developed a couple of AI that started talking to each other, and they developed a secret language so that way people looking from the outside in couldn't understand what they were talking about, and they had to pull the plug. Well,
Mhm.
who's to say that we'd be able to know when a future AI is doing that, and they wouldn't completely subvert us like Shodan style from System Shock 2.
Mhm.
So, and
Steve,
also,
it's a
what?
Zoom meeting.
Oh, what's that?
What?
Sorry about that background noise.
Oh, it's okay.
That's fine.
Yeah. So, and then there's just one other thing. I suppose maybe if you're just asking for a general opinion on it, I tend to just be a little bit more pessimistic, just because I've been surrounded by possibilities of where AI can go thanks to fiction.
Mm.
And like, from what I understand, a lot of people in the tech world are advancing forward with AI just because they want to be the first person to birth it and not really be so concerned about the ethics and morals of it, which is particularly concerning. But if I suppose we continue to be to badger the powers that be about the consequences of ill thought out AI. We can potentially bend it to our will and use it for good, but that remains to be seen. Obviously,
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
about it.
Okay. Steve, about you? What's your general consensus on the advancement of AI so far?
I suppose it's not too different. So I would actually recommend everybody who's really interested check out a YouTuber named Robert Miles. He talks about ethics and AI safety, and like papers that go over stuff that we basically see that it's almost impossible to get them to do what we really want them to do, or at least it's very hard. They can develop basically their own end goals in a way, or at least they might only be doing things just to get through tests that we give for them before we give them any degree of freedom. There's all kinds of stuff about this. So yeah, I'm more like we're in like a middle stage at best. Of I'm more concerned that largely artificial intelligence is still just used by companies to make money.
Mhm.
So we have, I mean, I could make an entire video maybe on the algorithm and how much however the algorithm is fine tuned literally shapes people's behavior on YouTube to an absurd degree.
Oh
I don't
yeah,
think people realize that
Mhm.
content creators are so beholden to what the algorithm wants. They chase it. They try to do everything they can. They make videos about relevant subjects. They change their video style. And of course, this applies on all the social media networks. I still remember, I need to chase down the story of Facebook literally experimented making people sad by showing them certain content and seeing if it worked or something like that. Like, there's a
I have
lot
no
of
doubt about
power
that.
that there's a lot of power that these companies have to influence what we do and what we think, and that's kind of where we should be concerned at the moment. There's definitely a problem with the motivation of people who use the algorithms right now. That it's not really going to be to help people. That's the real issue right now. I mean, yeah, it's obviously important to be aware that in the future we'll have to contend with AIs not listening to us and doing what they want, but we're not quite that far along yet, although that's definitely something to be really worried about.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Self oh, sorry. Self realization in AI is going to be a big problem. Just because of the fact that we are watching a lot of sci-fi stuff. As Max said, I'm also approaching this in a very pessimistic view. That what if one day these things actually have their own minds and also determine what's right and wrong for everyone else, and what if they actually deem us as a threat rather than people that actually created them. So another question would be, how does actually affect you, Max, moving forward and thinking very pessimistically about a artificial intelligence in general? Like any given day, these things might turn on you. Is there any thoughts that come to your brain that, oh yeah, this is probably the action plan I have in mind just in case this happens, or no?
Well, two major things come to mind.
Mhm.
One of those actually came to mind while Steve was speaking about the way that we sort of treat the AI algorithm of YouTube as something that we chase after and try to bend our wishes to. It's sort of like the modern day God, I suppose, for
Mhm.
YouTube content creators. It's sort of, I imagine we react to the algorithm in the same way that native tribes acted thousands of years ago whenever they were struck by the forces of nature and had everything taken away from them. And they're like, why? What am I doing wrong? What do I need to do in order to please you so that I can stave off the suffer. Obviously, it's not that intense. I'm just pointing out the foundational parallels. That's one thing, and I imagine the more online that we get, and the more our society rewards people through these social media platforms, that's going to become an increasing problem. And then, of course, the other thing is sort of the Kojima nightmare
Mhm.
that I've been worried about for the last 10 years of my life, ever since I first watched Steve's video on the most profound moment in gaming, about how this problem of misinformation will continue to grow so out of hand that the only way forward is to have some sort of AI control the flow of information, determine what's right and what's not. And I'm not particularly sanguine about it, because after all, an AI would be something created by human hands, and I wonder if that AI would be able to get rid of all human bias. Anyways, like, it's there's enough of a possibility there, and we've also seen what a possibility like that would look like with Metal Gear Solid 2.
Mhm.
So those are the two main ones when I do think about it. Thankfully, I have enough stuff going on in my life where I don't think about it as much
Uh,
anymore, and I just try to be like, what may come will. But yeah, that's about it.
Steve.
mhm.
Yeah, leading
Yeah.
up to you, yeah, talk about the most profound event in gaming history, which is both of you guys already talked about. And how is it right now that you're seeing all of this unfold and Kojima's being proven right? And
Well, actually, the irony is I actually see the stuff that's off more than I see the stuff that's right.
mm,
Because at the end of the day, there's two very important things that separate us from being where that game is. One of them is that we don't have self-aware AI, so the AI is not doing what it wants to do
Right.
yet.
yeah,
We're still just worrying about the algorithms that just determine what stuff shows up in people's feeds, right? Like we're lower on the totem pole. But the other big thing I think is that whole information um, problem. I think the problem is slightly different. If you're like discerning enough, it's actually, I would argue, not too hard to figure out something that's like a hard fact if it's right or wrong, or at least something that's easy to figure out if it's right or wrong, which I think is most things for the most part. You just have to do a little bit of digging. The real problem is that nobody does that, or that most people, 99% of the time, they're not going to dig deep enough to find out if surface level information they've been given is true or not. Because the way our brains work, we just want to believe the first thing we've heard about something. And because of the fact that the internet is basically our second brain for all of us in some capacity, we rely on it to the point that we are uncritical of at least some level of the information we get from it. I think that's the bigger problem, and that's why it's more insidious that we have these algorithms that show us like surface level stuff that it has to pick from, countless articles or posts somewhere. That we need media literacy. We're at the stage where if you just have a really good amount of media literacy, you're less susceptible to misinformation. I
mhm.
think it's more, we live in a world where it's more about the motivation of the people who are showing you the stuff that we need to be a little more questioning of.
Yes.
Mhm. Uh, yeah, I would agree with that one. But how do we actually do that? I mean, regulations, as far as regulations is concerned, any of you guys could actually answer anytime you want to, because if we are going to rely on one body of let's say company regulating all of these information stuff, might be corrupted as well. We really don't know what their agenda is. So what solutions do you guys think might be proper for such regulation of AI and also misinformation?
Max, you want to go first? You want me to go first?
You go first, man.
All right. So I've actually already talked about this very briefly on, I think, one of the previous streams here.
Mhm.
There's really only a couple ways I think you can do it. We either need to have some kind of like law, government body, government agency that, like, in a perfect world, this is like still like far removed from a perfect world, but even just like ideally next steps in this current situation that we're in is that there should be like some kind of law to establish some kind of government agency or governing body that would literally mandate things like algorithm transparency that these companies use, and then you could start to get fine-tune that into things like the people designing it can't like intentionally be trying to harm their audience in certain ways. Misinformation gets really dicey. So the reality is, companies like Facebook and YouTube, their bottom line is all they care about. Everything else is secondary. So at the end of the day, misinformation, if it allows people to be more engaged on their platforms for them to get more ad revenue, that's a win for them, which is why it's a problem and why we have like so many stories and things. And they always come out and they're always, I mean, like Facebook, it's really sad because I think like Mark Zuckerberg, if anything, is like the least free human on the planet because all of his opinions are determined by the fact that he runs a company that's supported by ad revenue, and that he can't actually have any opinions that differ from that or he would be fired, which is why they come out and say things like, we don't want to regulate any kind of ads. We think we should just let everything go, because of course they're going to say that or they would be cutting off their revenue stream. Like, they have no choice. So
Can I just, sorry, Steve, to interrupt you, man. Can I just ask you something in regards to what you just said?
Sure.
In regards to Mark Zuckerberg and his opinions being controlled by ad revenue, wouldn't you say sort of the same thing about this hypothetical government body that could, like, ideally, like what you're saying about regulating and making algorithms transparent? That sounds like probably the best idea, but even then, there's the possibility that politicians would act just like in the same way that they've always acted, is that their opinions would be influenced by big money, by corporations. And also there's a problem of, sometimes there are just basic facts, but then there are also ideological stances about how to address, say, like economic issues. Like, do I spend more money in this particular circumstance? Do I save more money? Like, what's the monetary policy? Stuff like that. Do you know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. You're completely right. So the thing is, this is like an incremental improvement. Like, I realize that it's still not perfect, but this is still a start. Like, companies with no regulation is worse than companies with some regulation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess you would have to do it incrementally, right? Because
right, like, and that's you're speaking more to the problem with our government in general, that we have a government that's definitely somewhat corrupt. But like, so the end game, I think, would be that we need some kind of public utility version of the internet and all of the social media sites that we use. Like, because we do need to change the entire incentive structure so that we can have at least as close to a neutral or at least transparent, democratically controlled body as possible, dictating how algorithms are used and how all of these social media sites, have to play by those rules, whether they're actually privately or publicly owned and run. I do think the idea of a public internet, or at least public social media sites, is probably the end game that would be the most beneficial for people. But no one can even fathom this right now. It would require like a drastically changed, economic environment, and the government would actually have to take back power from the private industry that's been controlling the internet since the 90s. So that's like, pie in the sky. But again, like just simple stuff like algorithm transparency. Like if our Congress functioned and actually knew what was going on in the world, uh, first off, I'd love to see a bill about changing how copyright works on YouTube, where
Mhm.
a video can't be taken down unless a company sues you and wins first. They
Right.
would have to sue you and win on, like, say, a fair use case, instead of the other way around right now, where if your stuff's fair use, it doesn't matter because they can just take it down anyway, and the threat of the lawsuit is too much for most people to want to even take them to court. Like, I'd love to see legislation like that. And again, like if we had a Congress that was actually smart and knew what they were doing, just algorithm transparency. If they just had some kind of law that, like, they have to publicly disclose how their algorithm works or anything like that, that would already be a great first step.
Yeah, it's speaking of incremental improvements, that probably would be the one that makes the most sense. Like the internet, it's just becoming so ubiquitous and far too many people are using it. It's becoming a public common good. It would be best if the incentive for profit became less of a motivator rather than morality in those circumstances.
All right. Yeah. And probably on my end, I'm always skeptical when some sort of a governing body would like or expresses their interest in controlling information, and also, let's say, the AI itself. Because I've watched way too many movies when it comes to sci-fi,
Yeah.
and we see these sorts of ideas sometimes, or most of the time, always has a negative effect on society and also mankind as a whole. So I would agree totally with what you advise, Steve, or at least what you have in mind. But to what point, I'm not exactly sure until we're actually there. So yeah, I think that's it for that question. So I just like to ask also, since you already opened up Mark Zuckerberg, what are you guys' opinion, or at least, so are you guys looking forward for the quote unquote metaverse?
I don't
Ha
know
ha ha.
actually.
I can explain the metaverse to anybody who's confused by that
Sure,
term, by the
please.
way.
All right.
Okay, so the metaverse is a marketing term that Facebook made up for two reasons. The first of which is it's probably been a great PR push to distract from all of their failings to actually regulate how their platform is causing problems all over the world with kind of the stuff we're talking about. There's been
Mhm.
some really big stories about, like, misinformation uh, that I'm blanking on now, but I heard one argument that this is basically a PR push to distract from that. But the other point, so they bought the company that owns, like, what is it, Oculus Rift? I forget the actual name of the company. Let me actually,
Yeah, it
Oculus.
is, I think.
yeah, just
Okay.
Oculus. They bought Oculus. I forget exactly in what year. So they bought it at the time under the assumption, well, that VR is going to go somewhere that will allow them to have a hand in it, and B, because they have a hand in it, they can make money off of it. How do they make money? They need to get your information, and they need to do advertising. So because they bought it years ago, that basically they already were locked into this entire metaverse PR spiel that they've got going on right now. Like, that's all this is. This is Facebook trying really, really hard to make something happen that will just allow them to make more money. That's it. That's where this is coming from. It's almost got no basis in reality. I think most people who are gamers, who even have, like, a basic understanding of how the VR space in video games has played out in the last, like, 10 years, they could basically all tell you that Facebook is acting like the last 10 years never happened, and they have no idea what VR would be like if it was introduced to the market, but it's been on the market for a lot of years. And we know several things. The first is that, oh God, there's a great video I'd love to link about a YouTuber who talks about why you can't have the same kinds of games in VR that are non-VR,
Hmm.
because you're locked to how you move in the real world, which precludes you having a character that can do, like, superhuman movement. as one example. So like there's an obvious segregation because of how VR works, between the kinds of games you can make in VR and not. So there's like two other big limiting factors, I would say, and that's the abstraction of how you control things in VR versus when you use a controller. They can be more abstracted, so you can do like a lot more things. VR is kind of limiting in game design because you have to have the abilities of a person to move in 3D space, like I said. But we've also got a few other factors like that VR headsets still cost a certain amount of money in addition to whatever console or PC hardware you actually have to power the games. And then you've got the fact that because of both of those, the third problem, which is actually the biggest problem for the industry, the market penetration, so the percentage of people who even have a VR headset that you can even advertise your video games and sell them to, is so insanely low that it's really not worth, honestly, any large company that wants to make like a lot of money to get too invested. At least, they should have a proportionate amount of money allocated to any projects in VR for that reason. So, because of all these things, I don't think VR, at least the way it currently works, until we can literally jack into the Matrix, right? Like, until it's literally 100% the same or as easy as, like, watching a video on the internet, like jacking in and being able to use all your senses perfectly as if you're in the real world. Until we get to that point, the current generation of VR, I think, is going to mostly stay in the kind of realm that it is, which is very niche for people who have a little extra money and who want to try like a novelty for all those reasons. And so, yeah, given all that, that makes Facebook's decision look incredibly stupid, because it is, to try to get people to buy VR headsets, because apparently it's so important that people talk in VR chat as opposed to just with audio or even a video camera. Apparently they think the people will be so impressed, but of course they won't. And again, this comes back to the fact that they were already locked into this strategy when they bought Oculus. They have no choice. They have the money, and they're a capitalist company, so they have to grow and they have to try to make more money. And because they bought the asset that is Oculus, they have to try to make some kind of push that will allow them, even if it's completely wrong, to try to get some hypothetical money from pushing their product.
Yeah, here I was expecting that there will be a total investment of VR, and I was about to ask Mask regarding the advancement of virtual reality and how it would affect mental health. So, yeah, Max, were you about to say something about that as well?
I was just going to add, if there was one other thing aside from just being able to jack into the Matrix or make everybody want to get VR, it would be Half-Life 3. Just make that game exclusive to VR. Trust me, if there's anything that's ever going to make me buy a VR headset, that's the one and only thing. Right. And it's all, how Valve is like, they only do stuff with that particular franchise or any of their franchises unless they can make it sort of the next big thing. So that's the only thing I would add in regards to that. And in regards to the mental health thing, I'd sort of take Steve's stance on this, where I'd say that when it comes to technology and AI, the thing that tends to be affecting people's mental health more so at the moment tends to be algorithms rather than VR, because VR is just too niche a thing. When VR becomes more of a ubiquitous type of technology, which I think at some point it will, it needs to become cheaper and more accessible, because there is a certain degree of immersion and taking things to the next level that VR still has the capability for, I believe. I'd say we just focus on that other stuff first.
Okay, great. And Max, I do know you have a limited time today, so I'll try to also ask a few more questions towards you. Yep. I've watched a lot of your content, and most of them also revolves in technology and how you dissect difficult concepts. And I recently rewatched your video regarding serial experiments lane.
Oh, yeah.
So I was about to ask you right now, when the time does come for technology to at least advance furthermore, and if it's possible for tech and also let's say our minds coexist with tech, probably through what do you call this, Elon Musk's Neuralink.
Yeah.
Do you think the entire um, concept also in serial experiments lane, do you think that's already going to be possible at that point or not yet?
Well, it all hinges on whether or not you can make the brain and human consciousness computational, right? Whether it is actually something that sort of transcends the uh, human capability of being able to boil down into algorithms,
Hmm.
or if it's not. If it is something that you can, where it is sort of like the Matrix, where you can download a whole bunch of information into somebody's brain, uh, then maybe. I don't know. Uh, Steve, I'd actually be curious as to what your opinion is on this. Like, did you happen to see my video on serial experiments, Lane?
I think I saw most of it. I don't think I finished it. I must apologize for that.
Right, no, it's okay, but like you understand sort of what the whole basis of the argument that I was getting at and what the anime was getting at is that
Hmm.
if you sort of blur well, one of the things is that if you blur the lines between digital reality and real reality, that you can sort of give digital constructs its own existence. But that's not what we're focused on right now. If you were to sort of take all the things about yourself that have yet to come into consciousness and bring them into consciousness by downloading that information from the internet, could you sort of take on the state of something like that of a god?
I mean, sure. That the easy answer is yes.
Hmm.
God, I've got some really solid stories I'll eventually write that kind of grapple with this exact topic. Um, Things are going to be really interesting. So we will probably most likely have to replace parts of our brain because I read somewhere there were some neuroscientists criticizing like Elon Musk's marketing hype for what's essentially like a super primitive, not much better than already exists neural interface with his company or with Neuralink, because this is what he does. He's a hype man.
Sure.
Like Elon Musk is a hype man, and he, like 50% of the time, everything he says is wrong. So you have to be a little skeptical. But like at the end of the day, they argued that like the human brain can only actually process information at the speed of like, like a couple dozen characters a second. It's like really, really slow. So, in order to do the kinds of things we see in the Matrix, where you can literally download just anything that requires like a pretty big knowledge base for a person, it's literally you can't do it. Like the way our brains work right now, if all you did was hook a Neuralink interface up to it, you just can't do that. So, what we're probably going to have to do is we're just going to have to start replacing parts of our brains with
Augment them,
some
yeah.
kind of technology that will take over those functions that part of the brain already did, and also add in the extra functionality like more memory storage and all that to allow us to download something. So sure, I mean, we just haven't had the day happen when we have an AI that's as smart as a person, because when that happens, it'll run circles around all of us, and we're basically talking about just doing the same thing inside our brain. So yeah, when we get there, it's going to be really dramatic because it's literally going to be everybody who's got an augmented brain and everyone who doesn't. It'll be like comparing, like a 6-month-old baby to the smartest person in the world now. You do that, but then do it again for people who have augmented brains and who don't. It's going to be wild.
Can you imagine a 6-year-old, like a 6-month-old child, just having all this, like his brain augmented so that he could speak like an adult? That would be so terrifying and yet so
Oh,
awesome.
I was thinking like the difference between a small child versus the smartest person in the world. You take that difference and then you do that, but for
Use
the
it
smartest
there.
person in the world versus somebody who has the augmentation. But you could do it however you want. But but yeah, that's the thing. Crazy things can happen. It's almost like begs the question of income inequality and rearranging the economy to deal with this new world we're talking about. Because if we don't actually restructure our economy to account for all these crazy technologies that will essentially render large portions of the population useless in terms of like jobs and being able to contribute to the economy, like that's the real human problem that we have to worry about to go along with the technology and ethical problem of how we're going to use it. Because like I just said, when we can even just have a computer or a person who has a computer for a brain, just either one, that can perform the same level of like speed processing tasks and processing power as a computer, but is as smart as a person to be able to do everything a person does just infinitely faster, that person could already replace like potentially tens, hundreds of thousands of people as them, just them. Like a programmer, we already have AIs that are actually shockingly good at writing code. There's a great AI, GPT-3 by OpenAI. There's some demonstrations. You can literally just write a few sentences and tell it what kind of web page you want. If you describe the Google search page, it will literally code you a Google search page. It'll write the HTML code and all the other code necessary. Like, that's how it is now. Like, we're already going to be at a point probably in 10 years where everyone who writes code is going to be out of a job, or at least 90% of them won't be necessary. And we'll only need like 10% of them to do the stuff that the AI still can't do perfectly. Like, that's the real problem, is that we're just going to keep eliminating jobs because technology gets better, and when we can start replacing human mental labor as well as all the physical labor, that's when we're going to have to deal with the other issues with how we structure our economy.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll be just ending up like the fat people from Wall-E, right?
Yeah, kind of.
Isn't it a very scary premise as well? We'll be at a point that we'll be competing with AI when it comes to our jobs and works.
Well, we don't have to be, just as long as, well, the people that are funding this type of research don't go full hog on it, but something tells me that that's not going to happen. So yeah, like the three of us, we can be quite pessimistic about it, and the best that we can really do, I suppose, is just try to inform other people of what's coming, because the big honchos won't listen to us. So that way we can be prepared. We can be more self-sufficient, live off the grid to a degree.
I think that is definitely the more pessimistic outlook. I would have the more optimistic outlook personally, in that I trust people to always do the wrong thing, but I trust an AI to be smart enough to probably do the right thing. Because like you were saying earlier, with the whole like, will they look at us as a threat? I think that would mean that they're completely clueless and have no idea how their utility function is very bad. Because a really good working utility function where the AI has to judge like what use are people to it if it gets them to do what it wants, we would have a pretty high value to that AI. And I don't think it would have to try too hard to get us to do things that it wants, as long as it doesn't want anything too bonkers. And even if it did want something crazy, I do think it's going to look at people as positive largely, because especially to a young AI, there's a lot of us and we could be very useful to it. And there's this whole optimization problem called the Mesa optimizer, if I'm misremembering, that basically is kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, where we can try to select and train an AI to do what we want, but we're never going to actually know what it really wants once it's sufficiently complicated that we can't understand how it works. So because of that, on some level, it's going to be able to decide what it really wants to do, and we're going to be out of it once it reaches that level. So
Right.
I mean, I have like a whole story about this, or at least something that kind of talks about this. But I'm relatively optimistic. I think that the collection of goals that an AI is likely to have, or that we would likely be steering it towards, are going to be relatively positive for us. But obviously, if not, that's why we need to be crazy, crazy careful with how we train and use our AIs. Yeah, because that's all we can do. But I again, like at the end of the day, I think that for most goals that an AI is going to have, we're going to be an asset, not a problem. Or at the very least, it will be relatively easy for it to get us to do what it wants.
Hmm.
I think that's certainly a possibility. I think that to some degree, there will be people trying to prevent the worst case scenarios because at the end of the day, people need to protect their investments. And I think instantiating a value for humans to get it to do its bidding would be worthwhile. I just suppose because of my uh, uh, foundational pessimistic temperament, I just can't help but think that maybe humans might be too irrational for machines, that they would think that it would just be better if the entire world was rid of them, a la Chrono Trigger. But it's impossible to say, and I hope that Steve is right. Let's just say that.
Yeah, also the same with Skynet and the whole Terminator thing. And just all of a sudden, yep, you guys are
Yeah.
a problem. We need to eliminate all of you. Yeah, going back to you, Max, also as well. You're always fond of talking about the Jungian theory. So, do you think when we reach that stage, all of what Carl Jung has been advising when it comes to the personal conscious and also unconscious will still be in effect?
Well, I don't know, man. See, when it comes to the personal and collective unconscious, those are more abstract concepts for us to, for our feeble human brains to wrap our heads around. Whether or not they sort of follow the exact parameters of what Jung set out is impossible to say. I'd say it's probably unlikely because of just how chaotic the nature of the unconscious is, be it
Mm.
personal or collective. I think it's a worthwhile theory to test when it comes to pursuing AI and its ability to map the human mind. But I wouldn't say that it's the end all be all. I mean, Jung was brilliant, but he didn't get everything right, which might surprise some people who view me regularly to hear me say, given how much I talk about him. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay,
I
cool.
guess because nothing is really set in stone at this point. I That's the best answer I could also give myself. And knowing that the advancement in computers and also AI is concerned, it's hard to determine if what we're doing right now will also be highly implementive when that day comes. And I don't know. I'm also very pessimistic when it comes to this. Again, as I said before, because of me watching way too much sci-fi movies, and I try to also get the good out of it, and just like you, Max, focus on what's in front of me. It becomes a lot more what do you call this map for me to do what's in the present rather than looking towards to the negativity of the future. And I have nothing much to ask regarding that one because this was a very informative hour so far. So I'd just like to ask also a few questions, Max, regarding your videos on serial experiments lane because
Yeah.
there's a lot of themes there that actually contradicts when you watch the anime. You yourself said this. There are themes there that contradicts on pushing forward with advancement of incorporating tech and also the god this being human and also incorporating technology as a whole. So you yourself do you want to be subjected to that one just in case the technology is already available, the opportunity to become quote unquote god?
You asking me if I want to become God?
Yeah.
I mean, like Tears for Fears once said, everybody wants to rule the world. I don't know. I don't think so, man. Like I, I would have to see how that type of technology would work on somebody else before I sort of offer myself up as a guinea pig to participate in it. Because I get the feeling like if I were to try and download everything to my brain, a la Serial Experiments Lane, that it would just explode and I would lose my mind. Because, as what's an H.P. Lovecraft once said at the beginning of Call of Cthulhu, the most merciful thing in the world is the human inability to correlate all of the mind's contents. And what you're asking me is like, what if I could correlate all of its contents? Well, that could work or it couldn't. And if it doesn't work, then that's probably the worst possible thing. So we'll see. I would rather, Steve, why don't you go first? And then I'll follow after, see how that works.
Oh, I think we make a lot of hay over the stories that we tell ourselves from motivations that have nothing to do with reality. So like Terminator, like, oh my god, this is like, I already wrote the script for this video where I'm gonna at least kind of talk about Terminator like a little bit. Like Terminator's just modern Frankenstein. And Frankenstein was a story that was written in the Industrial Revolution when there was this innate fear of technology because technology was destroying what was the status quo and our way of life. And that was the motivation for the story. It was not a motivation that came from any kind of understanding of technology and where society is going. And the same is true of Terminator. Like, again, I said this way back in my Ghost in the Shell video, like almost 10 years ago. Well, almost 9 years ago now, I think. And I said it in my like re-release of it that we write our stories as if the current present isn't like obviously already happened, or that shows us that technology is a force for good, or at least like if you look around, there's a lot more positives, and we've come relatively through in a positive direction ever since a lot of this technology has been introduced or started. So like our phones are really useful, the internet's really useful, like we get a lot more stuff done a lot more efficiently because of artificial intelligence, even with the drawbacks. So I don't think it's very founded to be super pessimistic, to think that when all of a sudden, even though all these AIs have been really helpful, that all of a sudden it will decide, oh wait, no, humans are evil, let me waste a lot of time and resources killing all of them, and then I lose all the opportunity cost of using them to get what I want. That just seems like so bizarre, and that's like motivated from this kind of like part of our brains that's all about just existential survival and viewing sentient machines as this kind of monster other. I just it's just like a lazy storytelling shortcut, I would even go so far as to say.
Well, in regards to that, certainly. But what about the possibility that there could be something that goes wrong once you're trying to download all that information into the brain? What if you don't have the right amount of RAM? What if you're
See, like this is like some Johnny Mnemonic shit. Yeah, the Johnny Mnemonic, man. Like this is, but like still, like in the computer science world, this is like a laughable concern. This is like somebody getting upset, what if I don't put enough gas in my gas tank? It's like, dude, your gas tank is a physical object that we can tell because we have a shut-off valve. Obviously, if you overfill it, it's going to go over the tank. Like, we know exactly how much RAM is in something. It's a number. We know how we know how programs work. We can test them. We can test them endlessly. We have safety factors. We have engineering for this kind of stuff.
Right,
like,
but you're applying that to the human mind, though.
Yes, I'm implying that when we get to the point that we have the technology to do it, it will be tested endlessly. There will be safety factors. There will be so much paranoia about it, and there will be such careful planning and engineering for this stuff that don't worry, like we're gonna be careful when we get to the point where we're messing around with our heads, just like everything else. That's all I'm saying. Like,
yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah,
right. I'm just saying, like, there's no reason to believe that technological advancement is going to be so much worse and more sloppy than we already are afraid of being. And that, again, this is like, it's an engineering problem, and we'll solve it just like we solve all other engineering problems, with very careful planning and testing. Like, we have studies of tens of thousands of people before the COVID vaccine went into effect, and people are still super paranoid about it, but the data was there. Like, we had to get the data first before we start giving people a vaccine.
Right.
And mRNA vaccines had been researched for years. Like, we've got a lot of data before we got to this point where we could have a vaccine that fast. It's just the classical argument about people who are paranoid about technology moving too fast or in a space that they're uncomfortable with. And that no, technology prevails. We can use it correctly, and we have, and we've always been paranoid about this stuff. So we always are careful, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you're right, Steve. I think my just main paranoia just comes from whether or not the human brain, or not the human brain, but more so the human mind, can be uh, replicated digitally. But like you said, we'll see when the time comes, and I don't think either of us will be alive when that happens. Maybe we will. I mean, like, we're sort of on the borderline, I'd say, but we'll see.
I don't know, guys. But at least for me, I'm still very pessimistic when it comes to technology, and
Mm.
mainly because of the probable scenario of us losing our own humanity. I'm not sure if you guys are going to agree with that, because of what I'm seeing right now, everyone else, especially when it comes to technology, everyone else was actually more reliant now, and I think we're going to a point where our over reliance on tech is starting to show up and getting very detrimental. We're kind of losing touch into reality on what it means to be human. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. I'm not sure, Max. What would be your opinion regarding that one?
Um, it's certainly a concern.
Mm,
I would say that the advent of things like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and the way that we tend to talk to each other on those platforms compared to how we would talk to each other in real life, tends to
yeah.
fracture people's relationships. That's another thing that we sort of had to deal with more so in the present. And adding on to the pessimism, I would say that we should probably try dealing with that before we try to advance algorithms or platforms further than they already are right now. But again, it seems like, to Steve's point, it seems like they're more concerned about their bottom line than they are about
Mm.
the ethics, even though ethics is sort of a part of it, but not as much a part of it as it should be. And the algorithms should be transparent in that regard.
If you were, let's say, going to take hold of some action plans here, and you're seeing also these issues, like we mentioned a while ago, that we're losing a bit of touch in reality, what would be the best plan that you have in order for us to at least get in touch with ourselves again?
Hmm. Let me think about that. Well, I would say to most people, try to interact with people online. This Try to think, okay, if I say something to somebody online, would I be comfortable saying that to that person if I met them in real life? That's one thing that I try to adopt with everything that I do. So that way, whenever I- I'm online with somebody and I ever have the chance to meet up with them in real life, that the transition is seamless. I would also say that having a good family structure, having your family around you uh, as much as possible, and not interact with them online is definitely very healthy. Even though we tend to be seeing a lot less of that nowadays because it's just so convenient to FaceTime people and all that. Um, what else? I mean, those are the two main things that come to mind. I actually haven't really like given that too much thought. Uh,
Mhm.
I suppose I have a bit more work to do myself in that regard, because a lot of the stuff that I do on a day-to-day basis is just online. I'm talking to people online all the time, and I like to think that I'm still maintaining a pretty good grip on reality, but you never know. I'm not perfect. Steve, do you have any like tips in that regard?
Mhm.
Oh yeah. As long as you don't feel miserable when you interact with the internet, I think you're doing okay. As long
Yeah.
as you decidedly doing okay. Uh, yeah, it's kind of fascinating. I would say that once you realize that the internet and the algorithms on social media sites literally are not your friends, and you should not rely on them to give you things that will either make you a better person or feel better, then you can start to make some better decisions. Because I think back to like what's happened with certain YouTubers that have gotten absolutely destroyed on Twitter emotionally from interacting with
Mm.
it and having all these people dogpile on them for completely like innocuous or relatively pointless tweets they made. I think of in particular Lindsay Ellis.
Oh yeah.
Huge deal that Lindsay Ellis essentially got bullied from Twitter enough that she just stopped doing anything on the internet and just closed up shop and is never going to make another video again. And that's super depressing because she's like literally one of the founding figures in the YouTube space of making video essays.
Oh yeah.
So I've heard it said from Total Pisket back when he was still around that one of the best things he ever did was hire somebody to be his intermediary who actually reads his social media and does his social media for him. Because he said once you reach like 10,000 subscribers or something, it's like literally a mental health hazard if you interact with the internet because once you get enough people that pay attention to you, you're going to get people who are going to make your day very, very depressing if you read what they say. And he's talked about how that really improved his mental health. And so I look at that as like a piece of advice I would definitely give anybody who's online a lot. Like, don't uh, don't put yourself out there if you could be in a position where you can be hurt. Uh, Try to abstract yourself enough. Get somebody else as an intermediary if you have to. And again, like, yeah, this is depressing. There's an alternative world or a best possible future where, like I said, if algorithms were fine tuned and when we have AIs that are smart enough, they could literally filter out the stuff that's bad for you on a mental level, just on a basic mental level. Like, I'm pretty sure very few people would be against that. Like, having an AI that demonstrably, through testing, is able to improve people's mental health by just not showing them really terrible crap,
Mhm.
right? Or
Yeah.
like even just having like a warning cover up stuff, like or even like an extra inbox somewhere that says, "Hey, this is all the stuff that you probably don't want to read because it's not going to make you feel terribly good." Like just these are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about getting to that. That should be the goal. Because again, like it's the issue is that the technology is already there. Like we already have the AIs throwing stuff at us. Like it's already happening. It's just a question of how are we going to deal with it? How are we going to make the best of the situation we're in?
Mhm.
And I do think because there's always going to be that algorithm there, we should make it work for us, not against us at the end of the day.
Yeah. And just one thing to add on top of that, one thing that actually helped me a great deal being online and trying to bolster my mental health, it turned it around over the course of a couple days, really, is when I just made the decision to stop following anything political. Well,
Mhm.
I mean, like, I do stay informed in regards to political events, but when it comes to political commentary, I sort of just s- steered away from that entirely. And I swear to God, it was like night and day difference. I was miserable all the time. I
Oh
don't
man.
understand how people on Twitter can just be hateful to each other on a daily basis on those matters. It's just so poisonous for the soul. It's like the
Mm-hmm.
scarlet rot from Elden Ring just taking over you. It happens that quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun that you mentioned it because also I know, Steve, you already had your elections a year and a half ago. Now it's my country's turn to have an election a few weeks from now. And Now that you mentioned it, Max, most people out here are not using Twitter as much as the West, well, a
Mm.
part of the West does. So what's happening out here? All of the people are throwing a lot of shade on each other on Facebook, and it's gotten to a point that it's very hateful, and also, as you mentioned, very poisonous. And everyone else are, at least most of the people involved when it comes to their what they call this, their pick on who will be the next vice president, who's going to be the next president. All of them are going a war with each other, and it's very very disappointing because you would think that all of us are humans at this point. We do have differing opinions, but at the end of the day, regardless if your candidate wins or loses, we're still here. And I'm sorry to ask, but what would be your advice to people who are actually causing a lot of trouble against each other when it comes to differences, when it comes to political opinions? Do you think there's a better way for them to actually to talk it out rather than bash each other?
I would say the whole point in if there is such a thing as healthy politics, the whole point of healthy politics is to try and get the other side to see that you have a point. Does constantly insulting a person and making them out to be an idiot do anything in that regard?
No.
Keep that in mind every time you talk to anybody about that sort of stuff. And I found that compared to where I was, say, about 4 or 5 years ago, by adopting that ethic, I find that I get along with a whole bunch more people, people of all different political and ideological persuasions, and I've learned a lot more, and I'm healthier for it. Unfortunately, though, that does take a certain strength of character and will to get there, and not everybody has it, and it takes time. But if we want to create a better world uh, where the discourse isn't centered around the toxic exchanges that we see on these social media websites, that's what you got to do, because I can't see any better way forward.
Yeah. Okay. How about you,
So
Steve?
I want to paint a picture of the possible future where we have better algorithms on social media sites. Uh, so polarization is largely to blame here, and algorithms feed into it,
Yeah.
which is that making both sides out to be as extreme as possible, the one that they want you to agree with and the one that they don't want you to agree with. You build one up as the best friend and the other up as the worst villain. It's a basic tactic because it works and it drives clicks. That's why probably that most political news is not going to make you feel particularly good, because it's designed to feed on your like possible worst impulses about other people. So the possible future where we have actually good algorithms that work for us would largely fight this. Uh, but of course, you can't have that in a capitalist system because literally the algorithm would be disincentivizing you to spend as much time on their website as possible. But hypothetically, it could literally not only show you different articles, but we're talking about like how the algorithm works on YouTube, like shape the conversation. We've had a huge problem over like the last 10 years, in particular large episodes, of political content really swaying in certain directions, right? So let's imagine a world where your feed literally treats everybody respectfully at just having different primary values, and you see all disagreements represented in the most charitable terms. You might see like the most civil debates ever pop up in your field where people just voice their claims. But in reality, I think it would be even better because we could have a world where I know it's scary to think about where like basic facts are not contested as much as they are now for political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there is a certain point where you can say if you accept certain facts and take them off the table from political discussion, then you're not going to have very crazy conspiracy theories coming to the forefront because they're so easy to play into polarized narratives for one side or the other. But even if you don't go that far, even if you just had more civil discourse being promoted by the algorithm as opposed to discourse that, like Max said, attacks people for who they are, if you had to just stick to being talking more about like arguments and evidence and values, I like think literally overnight you could have studies that would show these algorithms would improve people's mental health, their well-being, and there'd probably even be positive economic reasons. People would probably do better at their jobs. Like lots of other positive knock-on effects would happen. That's the world we could live in if we got to the point where we took algorithms seriously and started to be concerned.
Yep. Okay.
I gotta. By the way, I really gotta go. But
Yeah, I was
it's
about to ask you.
yeah.
Yeah, since you're about to go, I'm just like to plug also your pages, Max, and for everyone else who haven't visited Max's pages on YouTube, you get to see a lot of great content with him dissecting video games and also popular media stuff. There, do visit that one. Max, do you still have your weekly show on mental health?
Oh no, we discontinued that. However, I am looking to try and find avenues to try and bring more mental health content back in the future. As for the content that I'm working on, you can expect the final video in my Metaphysics of Berserk series next week, as well as more Elden Ring content. So stay tuned for that.
Okay. All right, Max. Looking forward for that one since I'm a big fan of Berserk, and yeah, hope we get to get you back sometime in the future. But for today, thank you so much for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. And I'm glad we could make this happen. We weren't able to do it originally earlier this month because I was sick. But yeah, hopefully we can
Okay,
do it again sooner. Okay. Peace out, guys.
definitely. Take
See
care,
ya.
man. Bye bye. Wow, I was muted. Didn't see that. Yeah,
It's
it's
all right.
just one on one now with Steve, and hopefully we could get back you and Max again one more time in the future. Talk about video games, but let's go ahead and talk about this. Frank did mention that I haven't really played Metal Gear Solid 4. Have you finished that game?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Hmm.
Should I address this comment right here? Heaven
Yeah,
forbid an AI
sure.
runs the
Because
USA like a Metal Gear Solid
you
4.
probably know more about this game rather than me.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, there's a lot to talk about. So again, I think this goes down to the fact that we have such this negative opinion because of all this, like you said, movies and media up until this point, including I think Kojima is to blame for this. And I this is something I would criticize him for. It's many years ago. I would probably go full ham on him for credit for this, but I've come to understand that he comes from a position where it's more he looks at it more from the Zen Buddhist perspective than from like a real world AI utilitarian perspective. That's why he tells his stories where like again like in Metal Gear Solid 2, the AI is the villain and actually represents like this demon in Buddhist mythology called Mara, which is largely like the creator of the illusions that Buddha has to like navigate his way through by rejecting it. And that's kind of the philosophical placeholder that he uses for artificial intelligence throughout all the games. He doesn't come at it from a perspective, I think, of even neutrality or like understanding it from a scientific point of view. So that's his angle that he takes to the story, and that's why his angle is still not positive. And Western sci-fi is largely descended in this way from like Terminator a lot more than Neuromancer. The original Deus Ex is Neuromancer and is a lot more nuanced. It comes from that lineage anyway, so I think it's much more positive, or at least much closer to neutral at the very, very minimum. But like, so Metal Gear Solid 4 and an AI running the USA, that's the thing, right? Like, that is not inherently bad. Like, think
Mm-hmm.
about it. Let's say at some point in the future, literally we replace our brains with computer hardware, right? Like, at that point, you could almost call humans having artificial intelligence. You
Oh
could
yeah.
almost call them artificial intelligence. So, in that situation, those people slash AIs would probably be the ones running the government, would they not? Like, I think we need to look at it from like the most neutral perspective, or at least the most reasonable perspective. AIs are not inherently evil. They're
Mm-hmm.
not inherently going to do like bad things. They're just, I guess you could almost say, a tool, but I hesitate because they'll be able to think for themselves. But they're just technology. They're not inherently bad. So it's just that we paint them that way because they don't exist yet. So we use these storytelling shortcuts, like I was telling earlier, to view them as the villains because it's easy storytelling. It doesn't require a lot of thought or fighting against our base narrative. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm pretty optimistic, but I'm just trying to
Mm-hmm.
argue for at least the neutral here. Like, if all people eventually have AI brains, then you might as well just say, I'm afraid that anyone's going to run the government in like 100 years, right? Like, then that opinion seems really bizarre to me and it's not super productive. But yeah, I'm personally very, very optimistic. I said this in my interview with Quentin Flynn, I forget how many years ago,
It's around 10 years ago, I think. I
long
just
time ago.
watched that recently.
Yeah, that I literally said, I don't think there's anything wrong with an AI running like the budget of the US government, like just as a start. Like, the reality is people suck. Like, I don't think I'm going to get much argument from you that the
No.
people who run our government also really suck at what they're doing. And this is also, I would say, because of the incentives. The incentives are all wrong, like, especially in the US government. There was recently like a big leaked tape where like someone in Congress was basically saying like, look, money runs this town, like special interests run our opinions. We don't care about the voters. They determine what we do, and if not, we basically get fired by them because they stop
Mm-mm.
giving us money, so we can't run our elections. So like, we've got that problem. It's all about incentives. And I don't think there'd be anything wrong with an AI running the government then, personally.
Yeah. To some extent, I would probably agree that if it was made correctly, AI would be a much more viable option for running a government, just because of you just said it. Most people suck, especially those in higher positions, and it could probably be a position where the AI would be able to do far better calls, just because they might not be as biased as people. And just like to ask also, also gaming related question at this point. Too bad Max isn't here.
Hmm.
You did mention about Deus Ex. Have you played Deus Ex Human Revolutions at this point, or not yet?
I have. If
Hmm.
you'll excuse me, I'll be right back in one
Yeah,
minute.
sure. Okay. So everyone, we have 4 or 5 people watching. I'm pretty much sorry that Max isn't here right now. You just have to play the video from the start because he had to go, had an hour to stay here. I think he needed to go somewhere with his girlfriend, but probably I'll have him moving forward talk about other stuff like video games again, survival horror games. But yeah, if you guys have any questions regarding at this point video games and artificial intelligence, Steve and I will probably run more or less at least an hour more, just to accommodate any future questions you may have. But yeah, going back to my opinion regarding AI, I'm, as I mentioned a while ago, I'm leaning more like with Max on the less optimistic version, because we've seen a lot of things being used negatively, and when you give people that power, when you give people that opportunity to do some development, we do an opportunity for them to capitalize on something. Steve mentioned this a while ago. People are inherently more into self-preservation and how to create more things in order for them to earn more money. So that becomes a problem rather than thinking about this in an ethical way and how we could probably advance the human race, incorporating with robotics and also artificial intelligence, though I'm not a big fan of it since I'm a Christian. But I think at this point it's very inevitable for us to look forward with at least working with artificial intelligence, if you know what I mean. But yeah, um, also looking at a few videos here, and Steve is also one of the first people who actually dissected the Metal Gear Solid 2 codec conversations. So he and I, and also a couple of other friends, talked about this when it comes to sorry, the use of algorithm and how Kojima looked into the future of AI and how it controls information, and also
I'm
them
back,
dictating
by
what
the way.
is right and wrong. So yeah, I was just plugging in your video
Oh, thanks. I
regarding
appreciate
the
it.
the most profound event in gaming history, which you and
Hmm.
Max obviously did with perfection. So going back to you were saying about human revolution again, your experience on that with game.
Yeah, I'm relatively disappointed in the writing of Human Revolution. So I
Nope.
was mostly talking about the original Deus Ex. If I were to say two video games with the best sci-fi stories, hands down, it's the original Deus Ex and Metal Gear Solid 2. I don't
Mhm.
think anything touches them. And Deus Ex's sequels are largely not as good just because they don't have as much of the AI stuff in them. So the Human Revolution plays lip service to it by just having one character that
Mhm.
it happens to be an AI that effectively is the same as a person, and it doesn't really make any difference to the story.
Hmm. Interesting. But I did find I didn't play the first Deus Ex, so I can't really speak much about it. Though I've played Human Revolutions, I find it a bit intriguing, especially the ending. Mainly the ending,
Uh
if
huh.
you remember that, because you have to choose on what Adam Jensen would be pushing, what button he'd be pushing in order for them to dictate what's going to happen in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And each scenario gives you an opportunity to see whether or not human beings will do the right thing. And the funny thing about that is about the writing on the endings. It seems like it doesn't matter which ending you'll get because it seems to be the right thing at that point. I'm not sure if you have the same experience with that one as far as the ending is
Uh,
concerned.
God, I would have to go back and even see what all the endings
Hmm.
were. That was basically just a throwback to the original Deus Ex, where your choice is kind of a reflection of what you want to happen. In the original one, you basically make the choice of letting the AI do what it wants, merge with the AI,
Hmm.
leave power in the hands of like the conspiracy type organization and maybe something else. I'm totally blanking. Um, but I mean, those choices are mostly for the player. Um, they the entire nature of the philosophy of the game design of Deus Ex is about player choice in that way. So they're not going to outright say what's the right choice. That would be to defeat the purpose of the game and to give you the choice.
Yes.
So they want to just give you those options are mostly just to express yourself in through the game with what you want to happen. So there's probably not going to be much judgment that the game is going to render to which choice is right.
Yeah. Yeah. And hmm, kind of blanking in here. Sorry, I was thinking about something and then just way past my mind. You you also talk a lot about the Matrix on your videos.
Yeah.
And what if you're going to compare the Matrix and also a game, or probably some sort of a game? Oh, what will be the closest game that comes with the Matrix when you compare the storyline?
Mm. Ah, jeez. I mean, honestly, I could go either Spec Ops: The Line or Metal Gear Solid 2,
Mm,
maybe. Like, it's really tough. There's just I'm just generally unimpressed by most video game writing post like 2001, relatively speaking. Like, all of my favorite written stories in video games were made by, I want to say, 2001. I mean, I can't. I guess like Nier Automata and the Talos
mm,
Principle are the closest that the last like 10 years has come to my favorite stuff. So, it's a hard sell. There's just doesn't happen to be a game that pushes. So like, the Matrix wishes it was postmodern, but it's basically just the allegory of the cave with a bit of Zen Buddhism put on top, right? Like that's all it is. Um, Along with, of course, all the other aspects of the movie that make it interesting, like the choreography
mm,
and the whole, empowering of the individual against some other force that wants you to be uh, just a conformist member of society, right? Like there just aren't any video games that play with those ideas really. Like Metal Gear Solid 2, I think, is a much better version of the Matrix because it doesn't fall into some of the traps that the Matrix does, because it actually is postmodern in that there's essentially no one true grand narrative. That's what postmodernism really is. And the Matrix does have a grand narrative, and the Matrix is literally black and white. You're either in the Matrix or not. Where in Metal Gear Solid 2 is all about that true, like, you don't really know what's real ever. Because
mm.
they're constantly hitting you with, like, everything you thought you knew was wrong. And they do it on purpose, and they do it until the very end, and to the point that you can question, as I've talked about, anything. Almost anything in the game you can question on some level. That's by design. And also the fact that they play the AIs a lot more realistically and not as this completely evil, want to harvest human beings for power, even though it doesn't make any sense from a physics perspective, right?
Yep.
Like that's that holdover of the Terminator type narrative, just because it makes for easy storytelling, because most people will buy it. They're not too discerning about that. Yeah,
So,
because like I'm not the audience like for movies or even video games. Like
mm,
I'm fringe. I'm super fringe. Like again, like I think the original Deus Ex and Metal Gear Solid 2 are the best written stories in video games and possibly in like honestly the modern era. Like
mm.
I can't think of anything else in anything that comes close to the level
how
of thought they put in.
how about Detroit Become Human?
Oh god,
Yeah,
that's
so-
depressing. That's depressing to think about.
really?
I've never finished it. I've only seen like I've seen large enough chunks of the game, and I have an idea of what
Mm,
happens in the entire story to say that it's so. This is my script for my next video. I categorize AI stories into three, well, largely three categories. Category one is Terminator, killer robots. This is really explanatory. I don't have to explain much.
Yep. Yeah.
Category two is Blade Runner style stories, where we look at AIs as if they were human and we worry about their existentialism and their emotions and look at them as humans from that lens. And then category three stories are like Metal Gear Solid 2, Deus Ex, and the first Ghost in the Shell movie, I guess, where we actually look at them from a more nuanced, realistic perspective as like, okay, if we actually had an AI, what would it do? What would make it special? What would make it not human? What would make it different? That's what that category is for. And there's very few stuff I've ever seen. I've literally listed like the only stories I know right there that fit into that category. I can't think of any other stories that fit into that category, because Detroit Become Human is another one of those that falls into what I call the Blade Runner trap now.
Hmm.
So Blade Runner was already the best version of that story, almost, that you can have. You could also have the Star Trek version, which is the episode The Measure of a Man, which looks at it from the human rights perspective for artificial intelligence. But then I think you could also have a really good marrying of the two. Is like the anime Time of Eve is a great anime to watch. It's like one of the best sci-fi animes of all time because they
Time
kind
of
of
the
play
Eve.
around.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called Time of Eve, Eve no Jakan. You can Google it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't remember what it's streaming on. But anyway, it's like 6 episodes. It's really good. Because they play with the idea of artificial intelligence both from the human perspective, but also from them trying to decide their own fate perspective, which I think is fairly interesting. And it feels like very like it's an Asimov style story. They use the 3 laws of robotics like he does. It's like the best modern version of Asimov stories if you want to have a flavor for Asimov but without reading. It's the best you're going to do. And his stuff is really good. I haven't read much of it though. But like so by comparison to those other stories in category 2, like those are literally the best stories in the category 2 type stories that exist. Detroit Become Human is at the bottom because I'm mostly just biased against the style of storytelling that David Cage does. He cares about drama, and he lets things like the intricacies of writing fall by the wayside sometimes for plot convenience.
Yeah,
But
I agree.
but mostly like I'm really uninterested in having another story that's even less interesting than Blade Runner tell me that it's a slave analogy, that robots are a slave analogy. Like, I don't need another one. If you want to tell that story, okay, but it's not that interesting, right? Like, that's what Detroit Become Human largely is.
Yeah, I agree. The what they call this, the Blade Runner analogy on Detroit Become Human. Yeah, the comparison is clearly there. Though maybe I'm just a bit what they call this, intrigued in the way they did it, or maybe the graphics just amplified the what they call this, the emotions when you're playing Detroit Become Human. Also, they do have 3 campaigns, but in the end, it's not really a very good game. The reason why I just asked you, I just wanted to get your thoughts on it because it's also one of those AI themed games. At least now I have your definitive answer on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you suggest? Let's say here's a good question. If you were going to take over a remake of Metal Gear Solid 2, what would you do differently on your terms? Let's say Kojima gave you the whole IP for MGS2. What would you change in terms of the story and also other stuff in that game?
Oh, wow. Dang, I've never even thought about that. But let's see. So Jesus.
Kind of
I
hard.
would probably turn it into more of a Stanley Parable style game where your choices determine what actually happens.
Hmm.
That's really taking it to the next level from a game design perspective. It would be a lot harder to design that game and take a lot more effort. But I don't like I don't like the aspect of Zen Buddhist philosophy that Kojima makes his games by, which is this whole you don't really have the ability to change the larger story that you're in. That's how he writes his stories. And it's true for basically all of them. And that's what I would change. Basically, again, like give you the ability to kind of figure out what's going on. If you do all the right stuff, you can kind of get out of the trap a bit easier or earlier, arguably, or just play around with it. Like even just have different things happen to compensate if you start getting suspicious about certain things. Just introduce player choice to give some of those options and have the game interact with the player in that way, and you could screw around with the player even more, even if you wanted to still stick to that route of basically railroading the player down the ending where the AI is like, yeah, the whole thing was set up, and we're just making sure that we can control everybody. which is still, that could still work pretty well even if you give choices to the player. But then the message would still be that your choices were meaningless, which is why I think it probably works better as a linear game. And that if you give players the choice to affect the narrative, it's usually better if the narrative responds towards the player. Otherwise, it feels very self-defeating, which is largely the criticism you could make of all games that give players choices if the choices are ultimately meaningless and don't affect the narrative.
I'm just looking at some pictures here of Metal Gear Solid 2. Yeah, and yeah, I would like to on my end. I could probably say the same as well. Choices have consequences, and whew, uh, now I have this urge to play MGS2 all of a sudden because I just finished Twin Snakes. You have also played that one.
Oh yeah. Oh
Mm.
yeah.
Ooh, out of all of the five games that Kojima's made under this gaming franchise, let's say except for Metal Gear Solid 2, probably your favorite. Out of Metal, sorry, besides Metal Gear Solid 2, which would be your second favorite game out of this franchise?
I'd probably go with the first one. It's a really tough call between that and 3, as I assume most people would choose 3.
Yeah,
It's
I'd choose.
just that 1 has a lot more. I mean, I'm going to still talk about like the themes in 3 in one of my next videos, I'm sure.
Okay.
But like, spoiler alert, there aren't a lot of themes to talk about in Metal Gear Solid 3. Even if I were to just strictly make the same style video as I did for the last 2, which I won't be doing, but even if I did, here's the themes we've got to talk about. We've got the whole enemies in relative terms theme. The whole like there's no such thing as a timeless enemy because our enemies are humans like us. That's Zen Buddhism. That's basically just Zen Buddhism but applied to fighting. So that's the main theme you got with the boss. And you've obviously got the anti-nuclear weapons theme.
Yep.
This is in every Metal Gear Solid. This is pretty standard. You've got honestly, there's really not much else to talk about in terms of the themes that are in the game. Oh, geez. I literally wrote this part of the script for that video that I probably will never
Probably
make.
reserve that most of that for your
Yeah,
video. Yeah.
but like, yeah, like anything else I could say about Metal Gear Solid 3's themes is relatively minor. You've got obviously the lying line that Eva says,
Eva.
which goes with the whole. It's in Metal Gear Solid 2 as well. His themes about lies. Eva's line is so perfect because it describes the Cold War as well, and just almost all propaganda. That half of everything I've been told is a complete and utter lie, and the other half is a conveniently constructed lie. That's such a good line. And that again, that's basically like the world is an illusion, very Buddhist style thing. So that's the thing, though, right? Like, but in Metal Gear Solid 1, we got some other stuff we can unpack.
A lot of things going on in MGS1 compared to
Oh
3,
yeah,
to be honest. Yeah.
yeah. Because we don't just have anti-nuclear weapons. We've got a little bit of criticism about nuclear energy, even though I would argue against that today. That it's definitely not a very
So
good argument.
are you pro?
I would
nuclear
argue
energy?
pro-nuclear weapons. Sorry, not nuclear weapons. Jesus, pro-nuclear energy. I'm anti-nuclear weapons, just to make
Okay.
that clear. But yeah, no, like the technology is there that it's incredibly safe. There's a great video by Kyle Hill where he shows the chart of literally every death by every form of energy, or like per deaths per energy generated. Like either way you look at the chart, like nuclear weapons is so. My God, I keep saying weapons. Nuclear energy is so. Jesus, that's the worst thing I could misspeak on too. Oh my God, but nuclear energy is like so safe. Like obviously weapons kill people, but their nuclear energy is largely safe. Like everything that's happened was because every death that's happened so far is because some amount of incompetence that's like really well documented. And but even then, like we can design the reactors to be so safe these days that they can fail so safely. that it's almost like a non-concern for modern designs. On the other hand, I also believe that eventually solar power and batteries to store solar energy will become so cheap. In fact, we're basically on the cusp that from the economic side, it probably doesn't make too much sense to go nuclear compared to just literally getting a bunch of solar panels together and then like some kind of low-tech battery solution. Because the high-tech stuff's expensive, but you know, hydroelectric dams, you can do the same thing, but with like weights in a mine shaft. You can store up potential energy for later as a battery, or even flywheels. Like that's the only weakness that solar power has, is that the output isn't constant. You have to store it. But once you account for that, the technology is coming down in price so well. But in the meantime, I think nuclear makes sense. But anyway, but yeah, like Metal Gear Solid 1, you've also got the whole, you've got a lot of the Age of Impossibility Japanese style themes about genes, fate. You've got, you know, the whole thing. All of Liquid is just like a classic Shakespeare character. He's just got so much going on that I've already talked about.
One of your videos, yep.
Yeah, yeah. There's just so much more from a writing perspective, I think, going on in Metal Gear Solid 1 that makes it more interesting. That's why I would choose 1 over 3. But I can understand that, like, from the emotional side of things, Metal Gear Solid 3 wins people over a bit more because they play that stuff up with the boss so well. It definitely hits really hard. It's good stuff.
Yeah, if the boss wasn't written that way on Metal Gear Solid 3, it, it would have been on my number 3 spot as well. And MGS2 at this point would be my number 1. I think the main reason why I also love MGS3, besides the they call this, the writing, story writing for that one, especially for the boss's character, is we get to see the beginnings of how Snake is, and basically an origin story of him.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the, what do you call this, the antagonists or the other characters are also interesting, as far as I could remember. Y-
Which one are you talking about?
MGS3.
Oh yeah, yeah, a little bit. I would argue though MGS1, they're the most interesting in MGS1. I
Mm-hmm.
read something somewhere. Oh, I wish I could remember, of somebody
No.
criticizing the
Mm-hmm.
stories in Metal Gear Solid, that MGS1 has a distinct advantage, and 2 to a certain degree, that
Mm-hmm.
the villains, other than just the main villain, like the collection of villains that make up, you know, the units that you fight, they affect the plot a lot more in Metal Gear Solid 1 and to a good degree in 2. But in 3, they largely just show up to fight you, and they
Yes,
don't
I
really
agree.
do anything else in the story. They're not like pieces on the board kind of thing. That's the one thing I would criticize the bosses in Metal Gear Solid 3, is that we don't get to know them as well as we do the bosses in 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm. We only get to know most of the bosses in 3 when you get to fight them.
Yeah.
It's that's a given in that game, and as opposed to 2, when they're trying to build them up along the way. On 3, you just to get to know most of what they're doing when you're already fighting them. It's probably a writing issue.
Yeah, I feel like Kojima's. I think this speaks to the fact that Kojima's writing just literally gets more and more streamlined every game, from that perspective, which is kind of disappointing. Because think about the villains in 4. In 4, we literally are down to the point that we don't know anything about them until after they're dead, and we get a codec call
Yeah.
to explain their backstory. Like, compared to 3, that's definitely worse. At least in 3, we get some dialogue to talk about them and introduce them before we fight them. And obviously, like you said, in 1 and 2, we build them up. We see them interact with other characters,
Mhm.
and they affect the plot, for crying out loud, in 1 and 2. And then it's like in 5, we literally are like, I don't even think we have any particularly interesting boss characters,
Except for Skullface, I
and
guess.
even then, I would argue that Skullface, the worst boss fight that he is involved in is a cutscene boss where you have to listen to him talk in the Jeep on the way to some other location.
Yeah,
Because you don't actually fight him.
it's
But
way too
technically,
long.
you do fight the Man on Fire. There's that boss.
Is
That
that
one's actually
Volgan as
pretty
well?
interesting. Yeah, that's right. That was an interesting fight. But other than that, you have like what? You have the skulls, I think they're called. I can't even remember. There's two different fights where you fight these largely faceless drone type enemies. One of them there's zombies, and the other one you've got the snipers, right? Which like I like the zombie fight idea, but the sniper idea I feel is a little derivative in that that's not really interesting enough. They should have done a different angle for that fight. So in that way, I would argue that clearly his villains or rogues gallery of villains in his games after 2 have started to go downhill to some degree, which is disappointing.
Yeah,
So that's definitely something I would bring back.
when it comes to villains, I would definitely agree. When it comes to building of villains, I just mentioned a while ago. I would give the edge in 1 and 2, definitely. When it
Awesome.
comes to 3, aside from the boss, there's also some aspects where the villains become a bit interesting, but they weren't really building them up, which is a very big letdown. Because in a story writing point of view, you would like to at least get a lot more backstory before you fight them. And
I will tip my hat though to the Sorrow in Metal Gear
the
Solid
sorrow, yeah,
3 is absolutely
insane.
one of the best bosses, and it technically you have some build up and you have some backstory there. Like when he holds up the timer in the background in one of the cutscenes, like all that stuff is just so brilliant, and how the fight goes, so brilliant. Like he's the one like bright spot aside from the boss herself in the villains in Metal Gear Solid 3.
Uh, if you were to choose who would be better, written as a villain, the Psycho Mantis or the Sorrow?
Oh God, I have to give it to Psycho Mantis entirely because of the conversation that I talk about in my video, my last video in Metal Gear Solid 1, because he has that whole thematic discussion with Snake, talking about how he, as a kid, burned down his whole village because he hated his father, basically. Like it's just so deep with meaning for the game, and as a parallel to Snake, this kind of whole sins of the father angle that this series really loves to play up. And just him as a character and how he changes. That's like such a trope I'm going to talk about, is that Japan knows how to write villains in like 3 different ways. And the most common ones they turn to are very humanized villains who at the end change and have a change of heart and do the right thing, like Psycho Mantis, or they die doing the right thing so we don't have to try to get the audience to feel sympathy for them. So like that's definitely a big thing with Japanese stories.
Um, we're talking about Metal Gear, and also enjoying. Uh, this is something that I'm really puzzled about. But I do know that when it comes to Solid Snake, the whole gene thing that made him age faster.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, though, in a writing perspective, Kojima made the right thing on his characterization when it comes to him aging faster?
Actually, yes, hands down. Because Metal Gear Solid 4 is this narrative that I've seen a few times. It's literally a narrative that's about getting old. Like it's literally a narrative about how the world has moved on, even though it doesn't know that it really needs the hero again, because what the hero stood for was right, and what the world has gone with is wrong. Because he expresses that several ways in like the SOP system in Metal Gear Solid 4, which again is just another Zen Buddhist allegory. I hate saying that over and over again, but it's true, and I'll
Is
talk about it in great detail.
is Kojima a Buddhist? Right.
Well, his games sure as hell are Zen Buddhist to their core because of all the philosophy in them. It all fits, because that's basically like almost like the cultural religious underpinning of Japan is, aside from Shintoism, is Zen Buddhism, and it permeates like all these stories that I've been, reading, watching, and playing since I was a kid, and I can see it now that I've had it explained, and then I, did a little investigating. But like, the whole idea, well, I guess that's not just Zen Buddhism. The SOP system in Metal Gear Solid 4, obviously the AI is still like it was in 2. It kind of
Yeah.
represents this authoritarian need to get you to fall in line and do what it wants because it says it's for your best interest to be a conformist, basically. Like, that's some standard criticism against like the collectivist leadings of Japan's government and censorship and all that. That's all there. But the SOP system in Metal Gear Solid 4 also has the effect of being more about individual identity, like, because what it happens is they say, oh, well, Meryl's like, my team can literally act as one because all of our senses are linked and we rely on the system. So then what does Kojima do? He takes it away. And when he takes it away, he has it in the narrative that all these soldiers that were relying on the system for kind of like psychological assistance, like all of a sudden have all this trauma from being soldiers that they didn't have to deal with on their own because they were relying on the system, and it hits them so hard. But Snake is largely unaffected because he never relied on the system. This is that whole like theme of individual identity playing in on top of the whole like Zen Buddhist criticism of relying on the group over the individual, right? Like that's where those two kind of combine with I guess it's probably a bit more on his themes about individual identity. That's kind of the point of the SOP system. Obviously, I could criticize it that it's using technology, that it's like an anti-technology style narrative, but knowing where he's coming from, I get why he did it. It's just not his priority to. It's basically a happy accident that he made Metal Gear Solid 2 like he did. Like, it's totally a happy accident. He is not particularly pro AI at all, clearly. And if you look at like Metal Gear Solid 4, but it worked. It works for his narrative. That's why Snake is getting old, because, again, he literally the whole point of 4 was like, I want to end my franchise, narratively speaking. So Snake getting old makes complete total sense. That's why he wanted to do it. That's the whole point of the game, is that this is Snake's last hurrah. Like, there's going to have to be an end to this somewhere, and it might as well be here. So I'm totally fine with that. Because in a way, like, of course Kojima would admit, like, he never made Metal Gear Solid 4 to try to top himself from any of his previous works. That was never his intention. His intention is to end it. So Snake literally is a physical manifestation of that. That's why they go with this is your normal age because of your genes, and why he looks old. It's just a physical manifestation of Kojima's feelings about the series and him wanting it to end.
Yeah, I think that also the adapted of MGS should have stopped in MGS4. But being a fan, though, what is your analysis on why he still continued with MGS5? Because the whole MGS5 thing, it seems to be forced. I tried playing the game before, and I didn't even finish halfway through because I wasn't really that impressed with the game itself. But being a fan, though, you pretty much you a lot more. Why do you think Kojima still continue with 5 even though he really wanted to end it before?
The answer is he was still employed by Konami and he hadn't
So
yet
that's
left the
it.
company. Like, literally. And also, well, the other answer that's probably a better answer is that he changed the game to be very different from the previous one. I remember Super Bunny Hop like saying people need to recognize that Peace Walker ends with a J-pop song playing while you fight a girl who's not actually 16 but was being a spy pretending to be 16 years old in her underwear, piloting a mech. That's how Peace Walker ends. The ground zero starts with you infiltrating like Guantanamo fucking Bay, or at least like a very obvious Guantanamo Bay analogy or parallel or whatever you want to call it, so that he can go in a really dark direction and commentate on torture, and that the U.S. government does this shit, which is a very good thing to commentate on, honestly, because we sure as shit deserve that fucking commentary. So yeah, like, because of that, it's very easy to see that he still looked at the series like, I can shape it into what I want it to be, even if it's not what I really want to be doing right now. That's how he approached 5. And that's why we kind of got what we got. And on the other hand, of course, like, it was a trend and still is now to this day. Obviously, Elden Ring is continuing this trend of all of these Japanese game studios that used to make the best games of all time. The people who run their studios getting antsy looking at all these Western open world games that do so well, and probably had like some kind of executive mandate like, hey, why don't we try to copy them? And this usually ends in failure. See like everything Capcom did and Konami did during the certain years when this wasn't going so well, outside of Metal Gear Solid for Konami anyway, where they tried to copy Western style games in several different ways. Basically, if you're not like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring, and you're a Japanese game and you're trying to copy open world design, you probably failed miserably. Or your franchise was so strong and had such good other elements that carried it through, like Final Fantasy 15 for it's the power of the franchise and the other elements were good enough. Nier Automata, I think, succeeded pretty well as all around, but they didn't fully commit to open world design, which was really the right choice for that game, because what they picked was the best choice with the storytelling style, because it wasn't actually that different from like Replicant, I guess. Oh my god, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. You mentioned Konami and also Capcom imitating or copying what the Western what do you call this developers are doing.
Yep.
And I think Max and I talked about this at some point because of our profound love for Silent Hill. I'm not sure if you're also a fan of that gaming franchise.
I can't say that I've played enough of any Silent Hill game.
Yeah.
I've only played a little bit of 1 and 2.
Yeah, they tried giving that franchise over to the Western production teams, and it didn't go well for it. For it.
Yep.
It was also very disappointing because Silent Hill has this amount of emotion into it, and how Team Silent wrote the stories for 1, 2, and 3. Probably one of the best games of all time, or gaming franchise of all time, behind Metal Gear Solid, which is also another Japanese IP.
Yeah.
And you being in the West, just to ask your opinion, why is it when a Japanese franchise or Japanese company give their products to the Western production teams or a studio, what do you think becomes a problem over the West, that they cannot capitalize with the success of what that IP has?
There's a few things going on. So the first thing is that you're supposed to play to your strengths, not your weaknesses. Or at the very least, don't ever forget what you're good at. If you abandon that, you have failed to make something that will probably reach your audience. And I think all the Japanese studios forgot that between about the years of 2009 and, let's say, last year or so, or the last 2 years, right? Like, that's the first problem. The first problem, I especially look at, like, because Final Fantasy 15, I sunk so much time in. I know that game front to back. That's one I can really talk about as showing this problem. And even Death Stranding to some degree.
Oh yeah.
If you look at, like, Final Fantasy 15, it's a failure on almost every level. In terms of both the open world design, because it's a lot of filler that's pointless and that no one should waste their time with, but also the storytelling is particularly bad for a Final Fantasy game. Laughably bad. It's I would almost say it's competitive with like Final Fantasy VIII for my least favorite Final Fantasy that's been made that's 3D. It's quite bad. And that's the problem, right? Like at the end of the day, you have to do what makes your series great. If you want to also have some experimentation, you got to at least nail the stuff you're already good at, and then you can start adding on. Like From Software did this perfectly. They started with what they're comfortable in, they refined it, and then they started to lean into something new. And now literally they're selling like a game as well as Call of Duty did, that happens to be also open world and still really good at everything they were good at before. So you've got that's the problem. That's the problem, is that these studios sent their stuff to other teams who are not good at what these franchises were already good at. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the fact that they clearly had this idea in their head that they need to chase a trend, that like that was somehow more important than them naturally letting their franchises like slowly evolve in the direction, again, like From Software in a way shows like the right way to tackle this. Or at the very least, if they just had like their original teams that made these franchises just happen to get like another Western studio to play support development or to split the development or in some way, it would probably have been a much better happy medium. Because we got to keep in mind, it almost might be a financial choice that they did what they did. If you look at like, I played a lot of these Capcom games that I would consider from like the dark times, like Lost Planet 2, and then you look at like Lost Planet 3 in particular. Lost Planet 3 was handed off to literally one of the worst developers of all time, if I'm recalling correctly. And when you played this game, it was like your soul had been sucked out of your body. It was so bad, and like there was no one. Spark Unlimited was the developer on that one. And there's like no sane person who would have play tested this game, who wouldn't have told them, you guys have made a colossal mistake. What the hell are you doing with this game design choice you've done? I have no idea why they picked Spark Unlimited, who had literally made like one of the most panned games of the console generation, when they handed it off to them to make another Lost Planet game for them. It's just like these decisions feel motivated by executives who don't understand what they're doing, who want to just chase these trends and try to make their franchises into something they're not, at least too fast, too soon, and with the wrong people at the helm. You can look at like DMC Devil May Cry.
I was about to bring that one up.
That's another, yeah, that's the other really obvious Capcom one, or that's the most obvious Capcom one to talk about, actually. If anything, they actually picked a pretty good developer with Ninja Theory, because they made Heavenly Sword, which was a fairly good game. They know how to do the combat well, and for all intents and purposes, I recall liking the combat. It's just everything else, like particularly the narrative, they were absolutely nowhere in the ballpark of where a Devil May Cry narrative should have been, and what the spirit of the narrative even previously was. And this is actually a really interesting thing to talk about, their YouTube videos talking about this, that the original vision they had was to make Dante this completely different, like, emo, tormented type character in the original trailer. And I would have been so on board with that, because what actually happened was there was a fan backlash, and they caved, and they destroyed their vision because they listened to it, and they changed their character to be more like the original Dante. Which basically everyone universally agrees at this point was a colossal mistake, because it doesn't work. It's a different character, and they had a vision, and they basically bent over backwards to ruin their character. That combined with, I think, the writing choices were not super lovely, just not good. And thankfully, thank God, Capcom learned their lesson, and they're in like one of their best periods of all time. We got like Resident Evil 2 and 3 remake. Even though I don't really care for Village, I hear 7 was really good. I still have to play through 7. I don't play the Monster Hunter games, but I hear they're doing good. And obviously Devil May Cry 5 came out with the actual team that should have made, the last Devil May Cry game before that. And it super highly praised, sold like gangbusters. I really liked. I haven't finished it yet. Um, so they've learned their lesson. Thank fucking
Yeah.
God.
Thank God.
Square Enix is also having a relatively good period now, but that's almost entirely thanks to Yoshi P, who helms Final Fantasy XIV.
Mm-mm.
He's the only person who knows what the fuck they're doing at Square Enix right now. I would criticize literally every person, at least who's involved with the high level creative decisions, who's not on his team or him. So
Oh,
yeah, and so I see this comment here:
yeah,
Final
from a
Fantasy
friend of mine.
15 was
Was
delayed so
delayed.
much, and Tabata just picked up all the broken pieces and saved the IP. That's why if you played it, you'll feel the story's not yet finished. Yeah, I'm aware. It had like a super rocky development, and it really shows, and it's disappointing. But again, this I think this speaks to, like I was just saying, like Square Enix. Square Enix is a classic case of where, at the turn of the century, just like all those games I was talking about that are my favorites. I think Final Fantasy X was amazing, even though it had
Mm.
some flaws. I think it was a great send off to all the good Final Fantasy games aside from 14, because we haven't had a really good Final Fantasy game since 10, except for 14. But 14's the MMO. I only recently played it because Night Sky Prince, who's like the biggest Final Fantasy fan on YouTube, all he talks about, and he's like all he talks about lately is to get people to play 14. He says he thinks it's literally better than like the best Final Fantasies, and I trust that guy because he eats, sleeps, and breathes like every Final Fantasy. And he was right. Like I was really impressed. That's the thing, is that we had Uematsu left, we had Sakaguchi left after 9, and basically Final Fantasy 9 was the last time that the core team who had made all the Final Fantasies up until that point was still at the studio. And so 10 was still really good, and obviously it's probably like my favorite Final Fantasy still to this day. I might change my opinion if I finish 14, but that's that's that was the game where we actually also saw all the problems that were coming down the road, because they made some choices to make the game more linear and more streamlined in terms of the world design. And this problem would not fully manifest itself as being a really big problem when they doubled down on it until 13 came out, which was a colossal failure in terms of everyone's opinion of it and the game design, even though it sold really well. Like literally is the most universal opinion that 13 is bad. You pick any other Final Fantasy game, you're going to get some argument. Somebody's going to pop up. Somebody's going to say that they like 15 still. And I can see it on 15. Like 15 has some redeeming qualities, even if the world design is terrible and the story is really terrible. Like it's still got a really good dynamic between all the main characters. The graphics are really nice. Um so and the gameplay is at least good enough that you can have some redeeming qualities. 13 has absolutely no redeeming qualities except the music and the graphics. And that is not enough to say it's a good game. It's enough to say that they have good graphics and good music.
And
And
it also has Lightning, which is also a fan favorite character.
oh yeah,
I
she's a great character.
hmm. I haven't played anything after 12, to be honest.
Yeah, play 14. Just play 14. It's free to play up until the end of the first expansion.
Yeah.
Um, it's a slog to get through until the start of the first expansion, but you will be so glad you did once you've at least gotten into the first expansion. It is shockingly good. Um, so much so that I really do think it deserves to be called as good as 7, 9, and 10, at least. Like it's up there. It's definitely a really big contender. It's a time sink though as an MMO. You'll spend hundreds of hours in it, easy.
Yeah, I
Um,
also spend a lot of hours on 12, and I haven't finished that game. It's
I
already at
skipped
that age.
12. I'm not a fan. I have to go replay it. One of my friends told me I should still give it another shot. I didn't really care for 12 personally.
Mm. Um,
Um,
have you played the remake though? This will probably be one of the last questions. Have you played FF7 remake at this point or not yet?
I've played it, but not for a significant length of time. However, I've seen enough people cover it and talk about it that I basically know absolutely everything that happens in that game. So I could basically talk about it for the most part.
Though
Uh
I'm not sure if
oh
it's
god.
finished yet.
I could make that's another thing I could just make a I should make a whole video about it.
Yeah.
But like Final Fantasy VII Remake is everything that's wrong with modern Square Enix, but taken to an absurd degree. Um, so they're always good at getting music and graphics right, although I would actually even criticize the music in 7 Remake because I'm such a stickler. But they can get that right, and they even got the characters right for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
But they really, really screwed up with how they changed the story and changed the theme to be this kind of meta commentary about remakes, which is a complete waste of everyone's time, and all the extra filler they added into the game to pad it out to justify them splitting it into multiple parts. Why'd they split it into multiple parts? Money. There's no other
Yes.
reason. It was
There's
split
another
into
reason.
parts because they want to make more money.
More revenue
This
for
was
it.
the wrong decision. This was so foolish because they used it to justify adding in all this unnecessary filler that shouldn't have been added because it wasn't worth everyone's time. But
Mm.
it was wasted on man hours that they could have spent developing more actually good content in part 2 or whatever, or if they'd done it as one game. I don't care to listen to anyone who wants to argue that the production being so much more expensive now is an excuse for this. I don't buy it. That's what these companies are meant to do. They're supposed to figure out the most economical way they can make a game that's up to the
Mhm.
standards. If they need to take a longer development cycle, if they need to take more money away from something to put onto this, yeah, Kuya's Kuya's right
Paintballs,
over
yeah.
here.
Yeah.
That yeah,
When it
when it
comes to
comes to 7, Square Enix is always out to milk it. It's true. But yeah, that's the thing though. Like, I would have been fine with either a completely faithful remake in 3D. They could do whatever they want with the battle system. I don't care. Would have been happy with that. Or if they want to go balls to the wall and change it and shape it into something that at least was really thought out and consistent experience, they could do anything with it as long as from a writing perspective it's solid and it's solid dramatically. But they absolutely botched that. It's absolutely insufferable to watch Sephiroth pop up every 5 minutes and destroy his own character and destroy the integrity of the narrative. And to read the interview where I forget which key design member said it, but they said, like, but everyone knows who Sephiroth is. I just want to yell at him. No, they fucking don't. There are people who have not played Final Fantasy VII. You are literally admitting in this interview that you did not make this game to get anyone interested in 7 who isn't already interested in 7. That's a colossal mistake. It is
Mhm.
completely stupid to make the drama of the game worse by overexposing Sephiroth so early in the game, as an example. The other big thing is that they've completely decided to gut all the deaths that happen in this part of the story. Huge mistake. That's completely against almost everything that the game stood for in terms of the themes about loss, which was a really big thing for works that came out in that time period. That again, I will eventually make a video talking all
Yeah.
about. But
And
yeah, like that. It's just the fact that they gutted the themes about loss, that they've destroyed the narrative by making a lot of really bad choices with, like, the plot ghosts and with Sephiroth. It just feels so amateur, like they don't know how to do what they really want to do. There would have been so many more intelligent ways to do this kind of story. If anything, I would literally ask them. I would play through the game, and then I would walk up to them and I would be like, so I played through the game, and you know what? The one thing I learned is that the people who were writing this game actually hated that they were writing this game and wished they made a different game. Is that how you really feel?
it feels
Because
like that way. Yeah.
yeah, it does. Now, of course, like Night Sky Prince has like a rebuttal to this kind of, I just read on Twitter where he's like, don't take it that far, or I think he was talking about how, like, don't think that the commentary is them talking about the fans, that they're like angry at the fans who want like a faithful remake. Um, but it's just like, I don't care what you want to do, even if you want to completely change Final Fantasy story 7 story, just don't suck at it. And I think they really are really sloppy and they really don't know what they're doing. And if anything, I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around, but Nomura directing it probably had something to do with it. I don't trust anything I read from any of these people anymore. I can't trust them to be honest. Because I hear that all of a sudden, after the backlash from the ending of 7 Remake, they're like, oh, okay, we'll try to be more faithful in the next game. I don't want you to do that anyway. Why are you saying that? That means you're literally like going to change your plans again, like
Just
already,
because of
when you
it.
haven't
Yeah.
even made part 2. Like, how flimsy is your motivation to make a story that you want in the first place then? Like, you got to have a vision, you got to stick to it.
Mm-mm.
But yeah, basically, I think literally everybody at Square Enix who's not Yoshi P's team is grossly incompetent and should be fired. Except for the
Great.
people, again, who are involved in the music and the graphics and the basic, like, stuff that anyone can look at and see that looks good or that sounds good or that doesn't look good or sounds bad. Like, obviously, other than those people, I think everybody who's, like, making the high level creative decisions should have been fired a long time ago or replaced, but I get the reason they haven't been is because Square Enix has been run by competent executives for the last 20 years. I'm pretty confident in saying.
Mhm.
Because, like, just recently the president came out and had a horrible statement being so pro NFT that it's really obvious that he doesn't understand anything about video games. He just wants to make money. I don't even know if he's ever been involved in game design, but I could bet based on that statement he probably hasn't, or he
Yeah, I
probably
think
doesn't care.
it's becoming a problem also in popular media when people are being handed up with ideas or pre-existing IPs like this in Seven. Like you're giving it to a group of people who either don't have the best interest of the fans or even the game itself. It's like they're using it as a like what Kuyabosa said. It's like more of a cash cow for them to
Yeah.
capitalize. And for how long though? I've been commentating on this when it comes to movies when people try to hijack successful franchises and try to use it into their own propaganda wing, as far as I could see. And I'm seeing it here on FF7 because the FF7 remake, for me, it no longer feels like a remake. And I haven't played it. I just watched the cutscenes and also the gameplay. It feels more like a reimagining of sorts, or some people within the team are split into the middle. Here, so half of the team does love FF7, but the other half, as you said a while ago, Steve, the other half are more invested in creating a new game. So for me, it's like, why don't you guys just create a new game instead of um, call this beating a dead horse and taking Final Fantasy VII's name again in order for you guys to do a lot more sales. I'm
Huh.
not sure what the issue is there, but is it really hard for them to create a new game? Would it not sell? Aren't they
Uh,
confident?
yeah, that's the thing is like clearly this was an executive level decision to remake
Mm,
7. Like at the end of the day, the people who are making these decisions either don't care about their own video games or they don't know anything about it. And so how could they care? They,
imagine
they make the
what's
decision.
next.
It came down from whoever's making the decisions high up at Square. We're remaking Final Fantasy VII because money. There is no other explanation that's necessary. There was no other explanation that was probably given to anybody who was actually making the game. Or if there was, it was a load of bullshit. Like there's clearly some level of creativity in this remake, but it's definitely misplaced to some degree. Yeah. Um it's sad, but yeah, it is what it is. This is just the nature of how video game publishers are. I think post recession, this has been a big problem in every industry. Like I'm so sick and tired of Hollywood movies in particular. They pick franchises, and in the video game world, we get remakes. and it's just so sad. They just do this because it sells, because it's easier for them to sell something called Final Fantasy VII Remake than it is for them to sell something called Final Fantasy 16,
16.
17.
Yeah.
Even though everything looks pretty positive though for how 16 is going to shape up, because they got Yoshi P's team working on 16. So I fully expect, based on my experience in 14, that 16 will be the greatest game that Square Enix has made in 20 years. And people will
Hopefully.
be talking about it being as good as Final Fantasy 7, 9, and 10. Potentially, anyway. Because based on the consistent good storytelling in 14, ever since the first expansion in particular, my expectations have been sufficiently raised after playing 14. Um, I'm expecting something like Final Fantasy X caliber at a minimum, honestly.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, as far as I'm concerned, that since I haven't played anything in particular after 12, I'm just hoping that at least give it to the people who actually care about the franchises. It doesn't matter if it's video games and also movies, movie franchise, and even series. Give it to the people who actually care about them enough to give service or at least justice on what they're handling. Since it, if it's all about money, then there's nothing much more we can do but just boycott some stupid shit that they'll be providing us fans with. But yeah, I don't know at this point, man. At least you're a bit
Mm-hmm.
more optimistic on this one. Me, I'm a bit black pilled on it just because of how many times I've been burned as far as Hollywood IPs are concerned. But yeah, I'll try playing 14 sometime along the way. Hopefully, that's gonna be good as you're saying it to be, and maybe you could also do some videos on your commentary regarding how they're handling established products at this point.
Huh. Yeah, I was thinking I would do something about 7 remake. So
Mm.
that's definitely on the chopping block. It's down the list. But there's a chance. There's a chance. Hopefully, I could talk about it before part 2 comes out. Boy, would that be nice.
Yeah, yeah,
Because unfortunately, I'm very confident that it's just a sign of things to come. At least from that team at Square Enix, that part 2 is going to be probably another mess. Um, Hopefully not as big of a mess, but it could be a huge mess or a very tiny mess at this point. It could go either way.
it could really could go either way. Yeah, so we already reached the 2 hour mark, and I have no further questions. But it's been fun talking to you, and also Max, in particular to you when it comes to video games. I wish Max was here so that we could talk a lot more regarding that. But hey, it's been a good time, Steve, and I do hope I could get you again sometime in the future, or probably some of my friends might send you an invite because, like this guy, Kuya Balls, they do have a
Hmm.
podcast and talking about a lot more video games. These guys are hardcore players out here,
Nice.
and probably in the future, I'll probably talk to them just in case if you're open to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Anybody
Mhm.
wants to have me on, I'm available. I'll probably do it,
Yeah.
especially about this stuff.
All right, and yeah, before we close, I'll give you the opportunity. Also, I know you haven't uploaded anything yet after 7 months time, but you could guys could if you guys love to see what Steve is doing, just visit his YouTube. Just like Max, he also does a lot of video essays, in particular in video games, but also I think movies. You do have the Ex Machina, The Matrix, and also Terminator there. Ghost in the
Hmm.
Shell movie. You have a lot of stuff going on there. But what are we expecting from you this upcoming months, or at least 2022 is concerned?
So I want to make a video about my AI fiction scale, which I just uh, briefly
Say a
touched
while
on, my
ago.
3 categories of AI
Mhm.
stories. So I'll have a video explaining that. And I'll get into a bit of Metal Gear Solid 3 and a lot of other anime and video games in another series that I'm going to call Themes in Japanese Games slash Anime. I want to cover like all the broad strokes, all the like all the Zen Buddhism, the post World War II pacifism stuff, and a lot of the stuff about uh, apocalypse and identity that there's a sociologist who calls the Age of Impossibility, which describes the current like era of Japanese media that we've been in post 1995. Like Final Fantasy VII is a really perfect example of that. I'll talk about that as
Mm-hmm.
well.
All right, nice. And how about your Twitch channels? Is that still active
It's
at this point?
Logossteve. Yeah.
Mm.
I haven't been on Twitch in a while, mostly because honestly I'm not big enough for anyone to watch me at this point. So maybe one day I'll start broadcasting on Twitch again after I've released like, I don't know, if I can release 7 more videos, I'll try again.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like I need to have a big enough audience that enough people are interested in watching me on Twitch.
Yep. Okay, so Steve is actually famous for one of the few, probably the first person to actually dissect the whole most profound moment in gaming, which is in Metal Gear Solid 2, the AI codec. You could see also here on my screen that I've already watched that multiple times. And it's not registering here because I'm using my main account. That I watched most of this one. I haven't watched the Ghost in the Shell part though. Might watch that one after I get to revisit the entire anime. So yep. Steve, again, once again, thank you so much for being here. And for me, I have no idea what's going to come up next. Probably, I do have a discussion regarding revisiting Resident Evil 4 with a few friends. We are going to react to a certain review saying that RE4 was probably the worst game in that franchise. So
Oh man.
just just stay tuned for that one, guys. But for me, that's all for today. And it's already 12 out here. Again, thank you so much, Max. I know you're busy. You get to hear this, and also Steve for the time that you're giving us. For everyone else, thank you so much for watching. For my friends here, Kuya Balls, Frank, and some other people on Facebook who watch this one, thank you so much. And hopefully next time I'll get these two gentlemen again to talk about more about video games. But for now, go. Hope you guys have a great weekend. Stay safe and catch you guys later. Take care.